Aloha and welcome to the G'day Show. I'm Sally Squires, entertaining the world. And tonight I'm reading Footstep 13 in my book Footsteps to Fairy Forest, because there's a total of 26 footsteps, one for each letter of the alphabet. And you remember the little girl had found a map and she was following, every day she'd follow the map and find one more footstep. And as soon as she finds the footstep, guess what happens? Another fairy appears. So we're up to footstep 13. When I woke up this morning, the sun was bright red. I had never seen a red sun before. It always seemed to be a bright yellow. I asked my grandma why the sun was red this morning, and she said that maybe there was a lot of smoke in the air and that was causing it. I went outside and sniffed the air, and it did smell a bit strange. So I figured that she was right. Grandma let me open up my map on the kitchen table, and it was then that we both noticed that the signpost for footstep 13 was what looked like a tiny red sun. I was a bit puzzled about how I would be able to see a tiny red sun on the ground. So I was very careful to keep my eyes looking downward all the way along the path. It was in a west direction, and it was quite hard to see any path as I was walking through fields and over small hills. I even went quite close to a big old brown barn, and it seemed that it was home to some owls because I could hear them calling out, "Hoot! Hoot!" I was watching the ground carefully for any sign of the small red sun when I banged into a wooden wall. I looked up to see that my way was blocked by an old red shed. I looked along the wall and finally I found an old broken door. It was almost falling off its hinges, so I pushed it with my bucket and it creaked open. I went inside to see if I could get through to the other side. It was very dusty and gloomy inside, but suddenly a golden ray of sunshine managed to shine through a window on the other side of the shed. I found a small ladder leaning up against the wall, and I worked out that it was just the right height for me to climb up and open the window so I could climb out. I had to push the window really hard, but finally I got it open and I found a piece of string hanging off the handle. I tied the string to the ladder, and once I was out of the window, I pulled the ladder through so I could use it to get through the shed on my way home. Luckily, the string was very strong enough to hold a ladder anyway. As I walked away from the red shed, I noticed that Willie Watcher was flying just above me. He suddenly took a dive right out of the sky in front of me, and I ran over to him because I thought he'd hit the ground and hurt himself. But he was fine. And as he fluffed out his feathers, I looked at the ground and I could see a tiny red pearl button. I laughed because it wasn't a tiny red sun, but just a tiny button instead. I said thanks to Willie for finding the button for me, and then I scraped away the dirt and grass, and sure enough, there was the stone marker for footstep 13. I was very excited waiting for today's fairy, and very soon I could see a purple and green flash. I held out my hand, and the fairy landed on my thumb. She wore a crown. She said her name was Memenoptera, and that she was the motherly fairy. And then I fell asleep. So now we're going to find out all about Memenoptera, the motherly fairy. Spindelitzia was crying, and Memenoptera turned around to hear her more clearly. She had only just put Spindelitzia to sleep in a mushroom cradle when she heard her cry. As she turned around, she could see a bright light, a light shining just like the firelight that shines brightly when the fairies meet in their fairy circle for a night of magic music around the fire. But this was not a warming campfire. As Memenoptera turned, she could see a horrifying sight. A huge red dragon was bending over the mushroom cradle and reaching in to pick up Spindelitzia. Memenoptera waved her magic wand at him and she called out, "Stop! Don't you dare take baby Spindelitzia!" And she flew up to the dragon's red head and looked him in the eye. "Put her down at once, you evil dragon. You have no right to take a baby fairy, and you know that." The dragon hesitated. He did not immediately put Spindalizia back into her mushroom cradle. Memenoptera reached into her secret pocket and pulled out a handful of fairy dust. She sprinkled the dragon's eyes with it, and he started to cough. As he did so, Memenoptera waved her magic fairy wand made of hearts and said her magic spell. "Unicorn universe unusual. Spindalizia safe and sound, sleeping softly and sweetly, mushroom cradle rocking round." Before the dragon knew what was happening, Spindalizia was out of his grasp and back in her mushroom cradle, happily asleep again. Memenoptera was furious. She hit the dragon's red nose with her fairy wand. "What do you think you're doing?" she berated the dragon. "Whatever gave you the idea that you could steal a baby fairy? Are you mad?" The dragon looked sheepish as he tried to open his eyes to see the fairy a bit clearer. As you know, it can be hard to see when your eyes are full of fairy dust. I didn't mean any harm to your baby fairy," he said softly. "I wouldn't have hurt her, I promise you that." "Then what do you think you were doing?" asked Memenoptera. She was still very upset and angry at the red dragon. "Let me introduce myself," said the red dragon. He thought that Memenoptera might calm down if he told her who he was. "I am Dragonestra, the red dragon, and you may not know this, but I have a baby just like you. Well, my baby is not a baby fairy, of course. My baby is a baby red dragon. Her name is Dragonita." "Well," said Memenoptera. She was not calming down because she was still very upset. "But you see," said Dragonesta, the red dragon, "my baby, Dragonita, is very lonely. There are no other dragons for her to play with." "Is that so?" said Memenoptera, calming down a little. "Yes," said Dragonesta. "Dragonita and I, well, we are the only dragons in this forest. So you see, it's very lonely for her because she doesn't have anyone to play with. No baby dragon friends, you see." Well, loneliness was something that the motherly fairy could understand. She knew how sad it would make someone if they had no one to play with or talk to or sing songs with. The fairy calmed down at last. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, I can see that that would be a problem. Loneliness can be quite hard to bear. But," and she waved her wand and her finger at Dragonesta, "you shouldn't have tried to take Spindalizia, especially when she was asleep. You gave her a terrible fright, and me too." "I'm sorry," said Dragonesta. "I thought that once she saw how sad Dragonita was, she would understand that she wanted a playmate." "All you had to do," said the fairy, "was come and ask me, and I would have been happy to take my Spindalizia to play with your Dragonita." The red dragon looked sheepish again. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I've never talked to a fairy, and I had no idea how to approach you." Memenoptera was not going to let him off so easily after he'd given them such a fright. "Well, that's not really an excuse," she said, with a stern note in her voice. "You must always talk to the mother or father if you want a playmate for your baby. Always. No exceptions." Dragonesta placed his head down on the ground in a show of apology. "I am so sorry," he said. "I will never ever do that again. I will always ask in future, even if I don't know how to talk to a fairy's mother." "Well, I hope you will always remember that in future," said Memenoptera. "Now, once Spindalizia has had her nap, I will be happy to bring her to your dragon den so that she can meet Dragonita and they can play together." Dragonesta lifted up his head and smiled. "Oh, thank you, dear fairy. That is wonderful." So that is a story about Memenoptera, the motherly fairy. You know, Hawaii is a microcosm of the world, with people here from all over the world. And Noa Hawaii is a microcosm of the traditional arts of the world, with beautiful patterns from many countries. They've been in business for more than 40 years with wonderful Hawaii-designed batik clothing. Their hand-dyed and handmade clothes have patterns that are based on traditional kapa and tapa designs from Hawaii, Polynesia, Micronesia, Indonesia, even New Zealand and Africa. So check out the wonderful items that Noa Noa has on their website, www.noanoahawaii.com.